Yeah. All right. Welcome, everyone. You're in for a real treat because you get to hear from me. No, really. So my name's Topher Sanders. I'm a reporter with ProPublica. I cover inequality in criminal justice, and I'm just really excited to be here. It's a real pleasure for me to be able to talk with these fine filmmakers. And so we're gonna just jump right into it. We'll do quick intro. We're gonna queue up some clips and a trailer for you to watch, and then we'll jump into a conversation here on stage, and then we'll leave plenty of time for people to ask questions from the audience. So with that quick introduction, again, it's a really special event. You're about to hear from directors of two of the most powerful documentaries on criminal justice in many, many years. Both touch on the elusiveness of justice for people of color. In one film, the victim of a crime can't find justice, and in the other film, injustice runs amok over people who have committed no crimes. Yance Ford's film, and this is Yance to my left, Yance Ford's film almost needs no introduction at this point. The beautiful, emotional, strong island. If you haven't heard about it, you've been living under some kind of rock. It's part family profile, part autobiography, part investigation. It's an amazing film about Yance's journey to learn what happened to his brother, how his brother was killed, and while doing that, examining his brother's death and the impact on him and his family. It's been recognized by nearly every awarding body in film, including an Oscar nomination and an Emmy win. And then to Yance's left, we have Stephen Maing, director of the newly released and critically acclaimed Crime and Punishment. I love this movie because it feels like some of the work I do for ProPublica if they were to turn it into exquisite moving images. It's really powerful. The film explores the truth and impact behind quota-driven policing. In August, the New York Times said this about Steve's work: "It is a powerful and suspenseful film, part detective story and part courtroom drama, fueled with a potent mix of curiosity and indignation, and full of memorable characters speaking in the lively idioms and varied accents of New York." I dare say it's trailing the same award-gobbling path as Yance's film. So look for that in the near future. So I think it's appropriate to kind of start with what seems like a very basic question, but I think it will frame the rest of our conversation. And this is for both filmmakers. Why did you make the film that you made?
I'll do a surprisingly non-personal answer to the question, because I think that that's really the thing that I don't get to talk about a lot. And in the context of my conversation with Stephen, I think it's important to sort of do a 30,000-foot view on Strong Island. I have an intersection with an issue that a lot of people are making media about these days, but that we don't really have a sort of longitudinal look at. 1992 documentary film is not necessarily looking at the lives of black people in relation to the criminal justice system. And I knew that when I decided to make the film, that I had the chance to tell the story from the perspective of a victim's family, and from the perspective of people who had once believed that the justice system would work for them if they played by the rules. And I thought that it was really important to show that systemically that the criminal justice system is actually not established or set up to actually deliver justice to people of color, poor people, others in America, and that my family's story, for as tragic as it is personally, actually held a much more important resonance, in that it could be an example that was not in the news cycle of exactly everything that would be in the news cycle and that had been in the news cycle. So I wanted to make sure that my brother's death was actually became a teaching tool in the conversation around criminal justice reform.
Stephen?
I feel similarly that, in a way there's always kind of a head and a heart answer to that question. And, I'll just start with the head part for now. That I've always been struck by how storytelling has this very unbelievably powerful ability to unlock not just individual but cultural traumas, and to look sort of deep into like sort of the longitudinal history that people are trapped within. And so I had been doing, this was actually the fourth attempt at making a film about policing. I'd done 3 other projects on New York City policing, and through that process, I was in position with my producing partner, Ross Tuttle, very well acquainted with a group of whistleblower cops who had, up until then, wanted to remain anonymous, but you know, felt things had gotten so much worse in a way because we were at this supposed sort of, you know, post-civil rights moment, post-reform moment, where de Blasio had been elected as a reform candidate, and yet nothing was changing. Things were getting worse because problems were being acknowledged openly, and there were no real substantive changes happening. And so it was almost kind of like out of having no other choice but to continue following the axis that had deepened with these officers who basically decided to fuck it and put everything on the line, and wanted to not be sort of these silhouetted anonymous informants from these other pieces that we had done. So, I just felt like there was a real need to make visible things that I was shocked nobody had yet explored in nonfiction filmmaking, and sort of with the tools of which only can get at certain kinds of very troubling kinds of humanistic information, human condition information, and also systemically expose what's really happening on both sides of this, supposed police community debate.
So I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't explore the heart reasons. And I like the way you both kind of laid that out and said there's a head and a heart reason for why you make these movies. So Stephen, let's start with you. What's the heart reason for why you made this film?
I think storytelling is all about understanding trauma in a sense. And for me, before I never even thought I would ever be a filmmaker. There was no imagery of, Asians running around in Hollywood directing films or even crewing on films for that matter. But, for me, it was the first time that I could put to words to a friend in my early teens, things that my sister and I had gone through, lived through, and that I understood that you could organize a very deep instability, deep trauma into kind of a narrative, a verbal narrative. And so that really stuck with me, that it was the first time I was able to make personal use of very traumatic information and grow a little tiny bit. And I took that, and it just sort of became this guiding principle that, wow, okay, you can actually apply that to the outside world as well. And so somebody who's very kind of obsessed with storytelling, but also secretly obsessed with how people persevere through trauma, individual and cultural, it was just, it was a perfect fit.
Yance?
I think I also came to art when I was in college, before my brother died, and then after he was murdered. It was where I found the place. It was where I found a place for a type of self-expression and sort of dissection of things that I hadn't had before. I'd always approached things from a very sort of analytical perspective. I thought I was going to be a doctor until I failed organic chemistry. I needed to make the film because I felt very seriously about having an obligation to not let my brother specifically, but my family in general, disappear. I think a lot about legacy and what I will leave behind in this world when I'm gone. And the fact that, I don't have kids, and it's a life choice that I'm perfectly fine with and happy with, but I need to make sure that there's some record of my brother and my family having been here. And this, film for me was fulfilling an obligation to prevent the kind of invisibility that often is visited on communities of color across this country, whether it's Native and indigenous communities, through the people like Stephen who don't ever see themselves in front of or behind the camera before 2018. So I needed very seriously to leave something behind that I knew would live beyond my lifetime.
What's been the impact of your films? Yance, has there been any movement on your brother's case? Have you heard from the DA? But then, what's been the impact on you and your family? And then I have the same question for you, Steve, after Yance answers.
So because the person who shot and killed my brother was brought before a grand jury and they returned a no true bill, the case was sealed permanently when the DA at the time decided not to re-present the case to a second grand jury. So nothing happened to him, nothing will ever happen to him. The person who was the district attorney at the time passed away in 2008, and as we see in the film, one of the two DAs refused to talk to me about the case, and the second sort of, glad-handed me until I realized that I had been glad-handed right off the phone. And really the impact of the film has been to release a lot of people from the trap that our broken criminal justice system really sort of lays for people of color, right? When it breaks down, in the face of that brokenness, you begin to think, or at least, for a crime perpetrated in 1992 that wasn't made public until 20-something years later, you begin to think that you've done something wrong. And so the film, most importantly, for my community, for my brother's friend who was there, and for all of his friends who sort of lived in this void of justice, my sister and myself included, and my mother, even though she never saw the film, it has really been a focusing point for us, and helped everyone. It's helped everyone say, actually, the problem is here. And I think that when you don't have something specific to point at, you always, turn inward, or it's been traditional in this country for oppressed peoples to turn upon themselves in the face of certain types of oppression, but this film has helped a very specific set of people actually free themselves from that, and that is a real, that's given me a real sense of satisfaction.
Steve, has there been any acknowledgement from the NYPD about your film and what you uncovered?
Yeah, it was actually pretty interesting. We were very lucky to get a social impact filmmaking award at Sundance, and 4 days after that, the department, the chief of department, Terrence Monahan, released a statement on an internal video for all the uniformed officers, 36,000 in the NYPD, basically reminding everybody there's no quota, there never has been one, and just in case anybody is wondering, they do not enforce, and nobody should enforce one. And then 2 weeks after that, actually, Commissioner O'Neill sent out an internal memo also on their intranet for all officers that a mandatory no quota training would be required to be taken by all officers, and in a sense also reminding everyone, if you're wondering, there's also no quota. And so the irony of that wasn't lost on any of us. And in a lot of ways you could see that as one of two things, either the department trying to maybe start to pivot away from a policy and practice that they know the public has been outraged over, and or to keep business as usual and lay the seeds for a kind of disinformation campaign where they would continue to not only deny the existence of a quota practice or its impact on the community, but also use this as a way of essentially saying that all the subjects in our film are liars. And on top of that, disgruntled with disciplinary problems, low activity and performance, bad apples, as they always call them. Every department has bad apples, and what we're supposed to do with bad apples. So it seems like things are not going to go the sort of hopeful, optimistic route. The class action continues to be dismissed. even after an appeal, it was dismissed again. The city is fighting tooth and nail to make sure that it doesn't see the light of day. There's a tremendous amount of evidence that's never even seen discovery, so nobody's even aware of it. That will be seen by the public eventually. So it's very foolish to try and wholesale this away and just say, well, let's pretend it never happened. One of the most alarming things is that Sergeant Edwin Raymond, who is fighting for his promotion in the film, after we finished filming, he aced the lieutenant's exam and should have been part of the last 3 promotional exams. Actually, 2 Fridays ago, or one last week, should have been present at the headquarters promotion, wasn't, and instead is receiving departmental charges for an incident that, if you recall in the film, if you've seen it, basically was a bogus charge against him for letting a black suspect slide just for being black. The most kind of ridiculous charge you could ever give somebody like Edwin. So the irony of what that's going to result in is, if they want to continue to destroy him, slander him, malign him, try and squash his career, it is activating a very intersectional movement and coalition around him. It's actually revitalizing the cause and exposure around what's happening. So, there's always a silver lining, I suppose.
Is there going to be an addendum to the film? Yeah.
Right now we're really busy just trying to work on a social impact campaign for this and get it out to community screenings. So.
All right. Yance, in your movie, there was a really critical kind of eye-opening moment, and it happened towards the latter quarter of the film when you told us about the profound act of heroism that your brother committed. And I just wanted to get a sense from you about that placement in the film and your decision to let audience sit with all of these other facts before learning that about your brother.
Sure. Strong Island is sort of set up, it's edited, the edit structure is elliptical. So we return to the garage 3 times, and each time we return to the place of my brother's death, we learn new facts about the case, we learn new information about him and about my family. The surprise, that's in the latter third of the film is that on the day that my brother was shot, that morning he had been the star witness for the prosecution in Brooklyn Criminal Court. In July 1991, an assistant DA had been robbed in an ATM on Court Street in Brooklyn, shot and nearly died, and my brother, like an idiot, chased the guy with the gun and apprehended him, and then went on to identify this person who spent 12 years in prison, and he was the star witness for the prosecution throughout the entire trial. We hold back this bit of information about him because what I found and what we see in the news, even with both St. John, right, is that when the person who has died in the name of self-defense is black and male and of a larger stature, it is so easy to project onto that person any and everything that you want to see. If you want to see someone who is ominous and threatening, then you will see that. If you want to see someone who is a hero, then perhaps you don't see that until you actually learn that he was. And so that was a very deliberate placement. And also, because by that time, depending on who you are in the audience, you have arrived at a determination of whether my brother's character, whether or not his temperament, whether or not his state of mind was such that maybe he did lose control. Maybe he did go over the edge, or maybe he took it one step too far, right? And then you realize that the morning of this incident where he was supposedly out of control, he had spent nearly 7 hours on the stand in criminal court being very composed, having, without blinking an eye, chased someone with a gun and assisted in his apprehension. And he actually was someone who was very deliberate about what he was doing that morning, and was very deliberate about what he was doing that evening as well. So that is the moment when people are often, and it often breaks down along lines of race, they're often like, whoa, wait a minute. He wasn't like, and it's like, gotcha. When people do that, it really is a gotcha moment, because they will project and have projected onto William just any number of things that they either put into the film that haven't been like a part of what anyone has said, or that they've intuited or read between lines that are actually not there. And the other thing that's really interesting about that character, his name is, his name is David. He was shot, and the NYPD shut down the Brooklyn Bridge to get him to Bellevue, which is the place where you should go if you get shot in New York, because it's the best trauma ER in the city. And that stands in stark contrast to what was, how my brother was treated, which essentially he was left to lie on the ground until an ambulance arrived 5 blocks, to the west on the lawn of the utility company, and he was transported somehow from the garage to that lawn, and then airlifted eventually to the hospital. The hospital did everything that they could to try to save him, but that instance of heroism also really teases out how some people's lives are placed at greater value than other people's lives. And we see that over and over again when that cop in South Carolina shot, I forget his name right now, but the man who was running away.
Walter Scott?
Walter Scott, thank you. Shot Walter Scott in the back. And then they lied about administering CPR and trying to save him. And then we see over and over again about how people say, oh no, we tried to do this or we tried to do that, and it turns out that you don't actually try to do anything. That is a very old pattern, and it was in place in 1992, and nothing about it has changed. And so it was also why we saved it until the end, because after you learned that thing about him where he risked his life for someone else, you also realize that his life did not even warrant any kind of urgency on the part of any of the law enforcement officers who were there at the scene. And they, could have bought him a day, could have bought him 2 days, could have bought him nothing. But what I do know is that they didn't buy him any distance between his face and the ground, because that's where he was.
Steve, in your film, it's the NYPD 12, but correct me if I'm wrong, I think you had 9 of the officers. Is that right? Talk me through your communication with trying to get officers to talk about this, and then what were your conversations with those other 3 who ultimately decided not to participate?
Well, the class action, just because it had 12, didn't mean that all 12 were sort of the in the same mental space. Some were being much more proactive in their evidence collection, in how much they were seeking out the media to get their message out, and there were definitely varying levels of anxiety and fear of retaliation. The moment they went on to NBC as a group, really it's kind of like put a new kind of target on their backs, and so it had a little bit of a chilling effect on a few of them. And even the most outspoken ones, the way this process works is that you can't expect to sort of shove a camera in somebody's face when they're going through the hardest, most trying time of their life, and try and be able to get all the material that you need in theory. So it was really like a relay race. A few would be willing to film for a few weeks, and then I would go to the next and the next, and there were all sorts of other officers that I was trying to develop relationships with in varying, jurisdictions and parts of the city that ultimately kind of backed out at the last minute. So it was honestly kind of a horrific process trying to just, do the opposite of what you learn to do, right? When you conceive of a nonfiction project, I cast as broad a net as possible and was trying to just vacuum up this world wherever I could get it, even if it was the littlest of scraps. And then the other part of your question.
You made me think of another question, but just your conversations with the three who did not ultimately participate, did you talk to them?
Yeah, I had conversations with everybody,
Yeah.
and just wanted to know exactly why. So out of respect for their privacy, I won't get into those conversations. Yep. But they didn't wish to be a part of it.
And for those that backed out at the last minute, had you shot film with them already?
No.
Okay. So this next question's for both of you, and we'll start with you, Stephen. What's been the reaction that the point of view of truth in your films are people of color? Does that in any way shape how and whether audiences believe those characters?
That's a really complex question. I think when you say audiences believe, which audiences? There's tons of people who, before the film even hit the theaters, were naysaying that these are all a bunch of, effing liars, and, we're gonna dig it. They knew they were gonna dig in regardless of what they saw. Many who believed this was gonna be straight up anti-cop. It's actually not. If you take note, it's about a group of 12 officers who love the job, believe that the social contract may be broken between police and community, but that it can actually be salvaged or made better than what it is now. But in terms of, I guess, sort of the impact, I think that there's this idea that actually, I think no other film than Strong Island, I think, really captures, which is, there has been something unforgivably missing from the visual culture, as they say, right? This idea of what is the kind of human experience and human condition, right? Like, the thing I think we share, actually, interestingly, is that neither of our films are procedurals. But what I loved so much, and I was just so blown away and really shook for weeks when I saw Strong Island, and I never got to say this to you, was just that, it like cracks open, this idea of tragedy that's cast in amber and takes all of those little shards of pieces and brings back to life what it was and cast in there in a way that is kind of like this radical reclamation of, frankly, kind of an incorrect history, right? That we have clearly we live in a structurally discriminatory kind of criminal justice system in New York City, and yet it is so hard to pinpoint kind of as they say in still photography, like the decisive moment, because it exists all along the chain, the food chain, from the point of, the first negative interaction and unlawful arrest, perhaps, all the way up through, arraignment, sentencing, and then you wind up, serving your time. At every point along the way, there is going to be some form of structural racism at work, and yet you can't call it that. You can't identify that. It's, surprise, surprise, so hard to prove that exists. But what you can do is make a film like Strong Island that demonstrates the human toll longitudinally and just how, just like tragic and insurmountable that is, and yet that there's dignity in that, and that there's this idea that I think, what we're doing is not straight, it's not journalism. There are sort of like acts of journalism in our work, but what I love about Strong Island is that it really makes true this idea that between the content and the form is the visual language, is the cinematic language, that something you could never say in any other medium like comes to life, and it's so beautiful and new, and it really, I think, shifts this idea of like visual culture around violence against Black and brown bodies in the United States. when you make such daring work.
Same question to you, Yance, about point of view and truth and believability.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you. We haven't had a chance to talk about our films together, but you know, the ironic thing is that in the 1960s, my father passed much like my brother did, the exam to become a New York City police officer, and much like my brother almost did, he failed to pass the physical because he had been chronically hypertensive since he was a very young man. And so because he wasn't able to ever really control his blood pressure, he was disqualified from serving on the force. But there is this sort of unspoken and unknown history of people of color who do serve on police forces, right? And you know, the ironic thing about Strong Island is that William was also on like a step away from becoming a law enforcement officer officially, and he was acting unofficially as a law enforcement officer, you know, when he chased the guy who shot David. So there's all sorts of incredible moments in Crime and Punishment that remind me of what it also means to come from a place, the suburbs of Long Island, that is the feeder for so many of the white cops who serve on the NYPD. Yeah. And just knowing the culture of Long Island, it's one of the most segregated places in the country, and all of the racialized attitudes of Black African Americans and other communities of color that are festering and breed uncontrollably on the island, and then are given 9mm Glocks and tasers and unchecked authority and put on the streets of communities like the ones where my parents lived when my mom moved to Brooklyn to join my dad, or where my mom was a principal in East New York. It's the ways in which the two films are in conversation with each other, and what I see actualized in the lives of these officers that I know the background of because of where I grew up and where Strong Island takes place. It's chilling, because the people who go, and you know, the guy who wears a hat, right, who's out of uniform, that guy who goes to supervise him, he's from Long Island, right? He may not still live on Long Island, but he's from Long Island. I hear it in his voice, the accent, the whole thing. So there's just so much generational bias that comes into policing from places like Long Island, where my brother was killed. And I also agree with Stephen that it's a question of which audience, because there were some critics who were like, well, you know, it's obviously the filmmaker's perspective, you know, and it's sort of like, well, you know, you're forgetting that when you listen to the police officer in the film tell me what happened that night, that he's essentially telling me what Mark Riley told him. So how is it that you think the perpetrator and his perspective or his point of view is absent here? You're just not accustomed to seeing the white counterpoint when it comes to films about the rights and the integrity of black bodies, right? So that's for me where the question of who sees what and who accepts people of color as the authorities on their own experience really begin to break down. Because even audience members from around the world, right? There are the trolls who are like, oh yeah, I'm sure he was an angel. It's like, you didn't watch the film, delete, right? But then there are people who surprise you and who are like, wow, I never, you know, your family is just like mine, and it's like, yeah, I know, that's sort of the point. But then there are people who are like, thank you because, you know, this also happened to me, or thank you because, you know, it wasn't exactly the same, but, you know, my loved one's perpetrator also was never brought to justice. I think it really depends on whether or not you are willing to accept someone who you have not traditionally ascribed authority to, authority. And from critics who, you know, sort of did their sort of snapshot reviews after the very first, you know, press and industry screening at Strong Island, straight through the folks who sort of disregarded it, you know, in sort of major, you know, trade papers or industry rags or whatever. It broke down almost exclusively along racial lines, and then within that, the socioeconomic relationship to blackness as authority. We could talk about that for hours.
So, where are organizers at? Where is we got till 5:30? Is that right? Okay. So we're gonna take 2 more questions here, and then we'll open it up. I asked the filmmakers to submit to me questions for each other. So we'll go to 2 of those. And this is for a question from Yance to Steve. Steve, Yance had a thought about apples. So I'll let her.
I had a thought about apples.
What kind of apple?
Actually, I won't go off on a tangent. So I think a lot about about Pat Lynch and the Patrolmen's Benevolent Association, and when I heard the 80% figure, when that poll where officers were asked if they felt like there were quotas or not, and 80+% said yes. I wanted to know where the good apples were. If there are 80% of PBA members who say yes, there are quotas, why are there only 12 of these officers who are willing to come forward and say, actually, like, we are dealing with a system that is rigged to put people essentially at the biggest budget line in our city's income stream? Where are the rest of where are the representatives of that 80%? That's what I was so confused. I was like, why are there only 12? Why are there only 12 guys here if 80% of the PBA says yes, there are quotas?
Yeah. Well, I mean, sort of to your question also, there have been so many cops coming up to the guys, myself, after screenings and saying, thank you, you did what nobody else in the department would ever do. And so we know that there's like hundreds, if not thousands, it's not just an NYPD 12, it could be 1,200 at this point, easily. And that would come forward. The problem is, where should they go, what do they do at this point? And I've kind of committed myself to staying deeply involved in sort of the impact and rollout of this, and trying to make this not just a piece of entertainment, but something that could be made useful. But we've had one city council person do a Q&A with us. Nobody's invited the officers or the subjects into their office. No elected official, assembly person, city council, any of the either the 2 cities charters, the mayor's office. Nobody gives a shit. And this is the most historic action that by a group of minority law enforcement, active duty, that the nation, let alone the city, should have been talking about. And it's sort of unfortunately becoming possibly another casualty of like nonfiction storytelling. We're going to do everything in our power to make sure that that's not the case, but we've had so many people. I'm talking to a handful of other officers, trying to help them navigate through claims that they have, situations they have. Other agencies, there's a whole bunch of traffic agents who are coming up. Just as a little quick caveat, $545 million that just traffic agents who work for the NYPD are tasked with meeting annually. That's the revenue that traffic agents pull in for the department, and they can't fall back on that number because the population is growing, so there should be, in theory, more traffic fines. As we all know, also vehicular stops, traffic, those are very complicating issues for, it's not just sort of like a driver DMV kind of thing. It can be a very quickly complicating issue in your life that lead you to an arrest. And so, there's, anyway, it's a really good question. We know they're out there, and we're trying to find ways to, create whistleblower support, and really find kind of political and in a way, pop cultural support. You know, if one celebrity stepped up and was like, man, this is really fucked up, that could really turn this thing upside down.
So you need like a Taylor Swift tweet or something.
We need our Taylor Swift moment. Yeah, seriously.
We need Dennis Miller.
Yeah.
Dennis Miller.
Dennis or Taylor, if you're out there.
Okay, and this will be our last question. It'll be from Steve to Yance. And so, Yance, Steve had a question about a statement you made in the film about your brother's killer. And I'll let Steve pick it up here.
Well, you know, it's something that just was so powerful, and something I really had deep sympathy for, which is that, you know, when you say that you refused to give your brother's killer any space in this film. And I really kind of on a profound, unnameable, intangible level understood that. I guess I was just curious to hear you talk about that.
Yeah. I think in the same way that I rejected the procedural approach to telling the story in Strong Island, I also rejected the idea that it was necessary to even show the face of the man who took my brother's life in order for him to be a subject and to be subject to critique. And I think that it was, you know, it's a powerful, or for me it felt like a very powerful rejection of the necessity of the white perpetrator. And that's because whenever the white perpetrator is in the story, it inevitably, because of the way our culture is, you know, sort of acclimatized to viewing content where there is whiteness juxtaposed to anything else, the scales of believability, of you know, authenticity, of authority, are they always inevitably tip toward, you know, what had been prior to that person's, you know, introduction on screen, sort of level to completely, you know, skewed. And, you know, Mark Riley did the ultimate thing, right? He decided to be the victor, and to, you know, and to the victor goes the spoils, but also the victor writes history, right? So I decided you know, that night, he decided that he was going to be the one to write the story. He, you know, in choosing to write the story, attempted, without knowing at the moment, to have me accept that version of his story, and by leaving him out of the picture, that was ultimately my rejection of his actions and his authority, in that just one gesture.
Wow. So we're about 5 minutes after 5. I think we can open it up to Q&A for folks from the audience. People who have questions. Is there a microphone that floats around? How's it work? Okay, great. And if you'll just stand up and kind of say your thing.
Hi. Hello?
You're already violating the rules, homie. You got to stand up, man.
Hello? Hello, hello? All right.
Oh, hold on a sec.
Here, try
There he
this.
is.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Hello? Okay. This is a question for Steve. So when I saw, first of all, I want to say like how blown away I was from seeing your movie, because I grew up in the Bronx during like the quotas and stuff. So like I felt like there was a scene that was in the trailer as well, where the cops went by and it felt like time kind of just stops and people were just like super aware where the cop car is going. I thought that's the best. I think that's my favorite scene of the whole movie. Anyways, I'm nervous. My question is, how were you? Because you made a film about like two kind of communities that are really closed off, like the NYPD and also like people in the Bronx are kind of closed off. So how, as an outsider, how did you get their trust in a sense to let them help you? I mean, let them help you tell their story in a sense, and were there disadvantages and advantages from being kind of an outsider of like that? Yeah. That's it.
Thanks. I appreciate those comments. I think whenever there's an individual embroiled in kind of a legal case, that always makes it easier to approach and express interest. And so in that particular scene, the one I think you're talking about, both of those young men had falsified arrest charges against them that they were trying to extricate themselves from. They were they're more than plausibly innocent of these charges. One was about possession of a gun, and he had sweatpants on, and there's definitely no weapon. Nothing was, there's no weapon cited as evidence, and charges, eventually dropped for that particular case. So all of the individuals that we filmed with had some sort of legal entanglement, and I think, as a filmmaker, as a storyteller, as just a human being, when that is the case and you express interest, it's very often that, even as an outsider, I actually happen to be born in the Bronx, but I'm not of that Morrisania community, that particular one, it was definitely something that they wanted to speak out against, out of a sense of deep anger and frustration that, for the most part, nobody seemed to give a shit, that they were constantly being targeted. Actually, it raises one interesting question that I was reminded of, that, so I was reading, you graduated in '94, right?
Yeah.
And that was actually the same year that Giuliani and Bratton, during his first reign as commissioner, introduced this thing called CompStat, which was the numerical policing metric system that has created this incredibly harmful quota situation in New York City, right? Where every month precinct commanders are grilled, are reamed out for not hitting a certain amount of arrests and summonses. The department will deny this, every time, but it's absolutely true. Everybody knows it. The president of the Sergeants Union has even said that the department is lying when every time it claims there's no quotas. So it's kind of interesting to track this, through so many different kinds of spaces. You could see the impact of the quota playing out, and that it has this kind of cultural impact too, that it formalized how we would treat certain kinds of communities, and because of the need for productivity in crime fighting, and also revenue generation, and also this idea that the mayor, the commissioner, everybody could say that they're being tough on crime. Sorry, I just went on a total tangent. I'm underslept. I have a newborn or a 10-month-old.
All right, do we have another question? Got a hand over there?
Thanks. So editing a film when you're doing a story about somebody else is already incredibly difficult. How did you approach the editing process when you're dealing with a film about yourself and your family and something so important to you?
Sure. So editing Strong Island was possible because of really, first of all, my editor, Yances Jansen, he's won the Oscar, he's won the Palme d'Or. He's a master editor, and he really, when I first met him, one of the first things he said to me was that the edit was a sacred space. And I really, needed to hear that from him, because it was like, I'm in Denmark, and it's predominantly white country with an all-white, co-production, set up there, and I'm like, God, I'm never gonna make it through this. Because I mean, part of it is like looking at yourself on screen, and part of it is looking at people who are alive and dead on screen. Like, my mother had been dead for 3 years for 2.5 years when I went to Denmark to edit the film. So there was the process of seeing her alive for 9 hours a day, and then at the end of the edit day, she was dead again. Seeing her alive, and then she was dead again. And so the way that we organized it was to refer to people by their initials, first of all. And then we never said I never said me, no one ever said you. It was always the character Yance. And that's how we referred to, me when I was on screen, and sort of having that third person presence in the room really made it possible to talk about both, my character's arc and everyone else's arc. They literally were just initials on cards, and everybody had their own color transcript. So it was just. We depersonalized it in a way that made it possible to get really, really personal. And it was a profoundly transformative experience in ways I still haven't figured out how to articulate yet, but I'm definitely not the same filmmaker now that I was before editing this film.
Next question. We got a hand right here.
Hi, my name is Sasha. My question is for Yance. I was wondering about the beginning of Strong Island, the choice of having hands moving photos as you are going through exposition of your family. I found it to be very like a beautiful yet simplistic and financially good way of going across that as like a visual use of it. I wanted to know why you made that decision.
Expensive to me.
Yeah, well, it's so funny that it looks inexpensive because I essentially created like a gigantic, C-stand, a copy stand with a C300, and then, a couple of years later with a 4K C300. So it was actually, an inexpensive way to do it, but it's really simple. Photographs they're objects. They're not just images. And part of the, feeling of the images in the film comes from my interaction with them. And one of my work study jobs when I was in college was to photograph the collection of the small art museum where I went to school. And so I was already accustomed to moving things into the frame, photographing them, moving them out, moving things into the frame, photographing them, moving them out. And before my mother died, Alan and I had shot them, and it was just very static. It was very still. I would slide, I would count, I would move out. And he would shoot me from the corner of the room because I essentially didn't have anything for him to do. But then after my mother passed away and the number of photographs quadrupled, we reshot them all over again with the 4K camera. And the quality of interaction with those photographs changed, partly because my mother had passed away, and partly because my producer, Jocelyn Barnes, said to me, don't handle them as evidence, which is how I first was thinking of them. She said to me, handle them with care. And as soon as I shifted that approach to how I would actually handle those pictures and touch those pictures, everything about them came alive again, which was the point of having them be objects and not scans in the first place.
How did you do your to-camera interviews?
My to-camera interviews were conducted by Rob Moss and Jocelyn, and I have to say that I got myself to be as alone in a room full of people as I possibly could. If you can imagine that there was a wall of sound blankets between me and all of you, and you are on that side, and you've got a monitor, and you can see me, and you can hear me, and I can only see the lenses and the two cameras on the other side, that's what we did. There's a black void in back of me. The whole room is black because I just don't want to be there. I just don't want to be doing it, but I needed to. We started my interviews 4 years after we began shooting the film, and Rob and Jocelyn were really in this sort of like years-long parade with me because I am somebody who can talk circles around you to avoid answering any kind of questions. And Rob and Jocelyn are so relentless. Like Rob said to me, convince me that your parents were afraid. And I was like, what? I said to him, you want me to fucking convince you that my parents were afraid? White guy who teaches at Harvard, sitting behind the fucking screen, asking me to prove something to you. Boom. And that was the thing that I said. I was like, literally, you want me to prove to you that they were fucking afraid? And he said, yeah. And that line is the thing that I said just before in the film, you hear me say, night after night, the phone rings. So they were able to outsmart me and to ask me all of the provocative questions and to get me so pissed off that I had to be honest. And it worked.
It's awesome. So we got 10 more minutes or so. Any other questions?
I'm just curious when you guys realized, after all your gathering and research and experience, when you knew you had a feature to make as opposed to some other form or some other story.
I mean, I'd be lying if I said I didn't. I really didn't know until. I mean, kind of just leading up to the last months, I was still not convinced it was, maybe halfway through the edit, I started feeling, okay, there's probably a film here, but it, I don't know, because I had it so, you have such, not high expectations, but like kind of a high sense of burden of proof that you're trying to put out into the world. Like for me, it was this idea like, this is a story that everybody thinks they know about policing, that it's like all social media feed inundated every day with these kinds of stories. But, I felt like, how do we like present something that felt like it was all about like, bearing witness themselves, as they say. And so I always felt like I hadn't filmed enough. And, when I was doing a rough accounting, I was like, oh, it's 350 days of shooting. I should probably just let it go and do something with this. So I'm the wrong person to ask that question.
I actually had two versions of the film. The version of the film that existed, and that was at 2 hours and 45 minutes before my mother died, and then the version of the film that was cut after I became a character in the film. And I thought at one point that I actually wasn't going to finish. I was like, fuck it, my mother's dead. This was all for her anyway. Why am I doing this? I'm not doing this anymore. Like, we're on hiatus until I feel like doing this, and I actually am never going to feel like doing this. But then I got over that. But then I also had to shift the primary storytelling responsibility in the film from her to me. And when we did that, I just had no idea. I literally, that's when I stopped being director/producer and just like leaned back into the director role and gave producer to somebody else. And I have to tell you, there's this great image of a cat trying to solve a Rubik's Cube. That at one morning during the edit, I came into the edit suite and that was on the inside of the door. And I saw that, and I wrote my name on it. It was like Yance with a little arrow to the cat. Because editing a film is, it's like, I'm not an editor, right? I really value the work that editors do. I really value the work that, like, elegant editors do. Was one of the things about Crime and Punishment that was so wonderful, in the way in which you transitioned us from precinct to precinct and character to character, and there were so many echoes in all of the experiences. And it was just like, when I saw the 12 for the first time, going into court, or when they had their like suits on, that one kind of like Rat Pack-ish shot when they're all, I was just like, I feel like I've seen this, because they've been in these rooms together and they're so dynamic and incredible, and everyone has their own individual line, but then they also have this great dynamic as a group. That's, you don't actually see that until you see it. And that's, because there are these incredible people who sit and punch keys and do all sorts of things that I pretend to actually understand that I just don't. But it's, when you watch the first, when I watched the first rough cut of the film, which actually wasn't very rough, it was really advanced because of the way that we had been cutting. I cut the film in 9 months, over 12. We worked for 60 hours a week, if not more. And it was just, it was, when we watched it, we knew it was there, we knew it wasn't there, and then we just kept working. And then part of it was that I had a deadline, and then, a budget and an out date, and an expiring visa in Denmark. And part of it was that, you push toward an endpoint, and we figured out at the beginning of the film where it was going to end. We knew exactly what the last scene was going to be, and we knew what the first scene was going to be. And the work was really figuring out how to get from the first scene to the last scene. And that was just, it was a thrilling experience. For as miserable as it was thrilling.
One quick thing, actually. So the hardest, the reason that made this hard was also because there was no ending, there was no resolution. The lack of resolution was supposed to be the ending, and I think that that's the thing that, next time around, if I ever do another class action lawsuit about a police department, I'll remember that you have to embrace the non-ending, actually, that's when you're dealing with live social issues that have to do, trying to pinpoint structural racism. You don't look for the hard ending. And that was really something that I could not wrap my head around. I, worked with a brilliant co-editor, Eric Metzger, and so it was, it was something that we really just had to try and problem solve. It was a pleasure working with him.
So we got time for one more. This gentleman here.
Can you guys talk a little bit about Netflix and Hulu and how they were to work with and how you got hooked up with them and how it kind of fit into your distribution plans?
I'll go really quickly because they didn't actually figure into my distribution plans at first. I was, supposed to be on PBS, and I thought I was going to have a traditional theatrical release, and followed by a public broadcast. We got to Sundance, and there were no theatrical distributors who were interested in the film. But Netflix saw the film at Sundance. And we had a drawn-out conversation with our public broadcasting partners in the US and in Denmark. And they realized that Netflix presented an opportunity for worldwide exposure, for this story that the two broadcasters together plus whatever individual sales we might have done country by country would never sort of equal that exposure. So, everybody was able to make the necessary adjustments to give Netflix an exclusive distribution. Everybody kept their credit. And that's how we wound up on the platform. It really was completely out of the blue for us, but they've been fantastic partners.
Hulu was the one main distributor that was interested, and I was thrilled because I also had this feeling that they hit a certain kind of demo that that had a lot of people of color and also cops would be going to watch in a sense. So I love the fact that also they were really interested in doing kind of an ambitious release and would put a lot of marketing behind it.
So I think that does it. I am so deeply humbled and happy to have been a part of this. Thank you guys so much. It was wonderful.
Thanks.